Good morning, everyone. I hope that you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving, that you got to eat your fill, and that you got to, and then some, and got to enjoy that time together with some family and loved ones. We have finally made it to the end of the book of Ruth. And so we're going to see how this story concludes today. Just to give people a little recap, little reminder, if you haven't been here or missed the first 3 weeks about Ruth, Ruth is really a book in 4 acts, or as we say, 4 chapters. If you're an artist, you might think of it as there are 4 kind of main scenes that play out. And the first chapter of Ruth, it introduces the characters. You see that there are some major problems that they're facing in their lives. Ruth and Naomi in particular have lost all of the people who are dear to them. They've lost husbands. Naomi has lost her sons. And really that chapter is characterized by death and emptiness. And we talked about how Ruth has a love that went beyond her obligation to Naomi. And so she loved her even when she didn't have to, even when it was difficult to do. Then in chapter 2, Ruth meets this man Boaz out in the harvest field. And we see Boaz, that his love, that his provision goes beyond what he's obligated to do as he tries to care for Ruth and Naomi. And then last week was our little bit crazy scandalous week, right? If you remember, where Ruth meets Boaz at the threshing floor late at night. So this chapter picks up after Ruth and Naomi have put their plan, their risky plan, into action. And now this is probably the hardest thing for many of us, or for a lot of us, is when you have a plan, you put it into action, and then you've done everything that you can do, and really all that's left is to sit and wait and see how it turns out. That is terrifying, isn't it? It's out of your control now, so you're just hoping that things will come together the way that you want them to. And that's it, right? We do our part, but we can't control it all. And so now we're going to read how the plan plays out from here. So in verse 1, it says, "No sooner had Boaz gone up to the gate and sat down there than the next of kin," this is this Redeemer, "of whom Boaz had spoken, came passing by. So Boaz said, 'Come over, friend, sit down here.' And he went over and sat down. Then Boaz took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, 'Sit down here.' So they sat down. He then said to the next of kin, 'Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our kinsman Elimelech.'" That's Naomi's husband who passed away. "So I thought I would tell you of it and say, 'Buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me so that I may know, for there is no one prior to you to redeem it, and I come after you.' So he said, 'I will redeem it.' Then Boaz said, 'The day you acquire the field from the hand of Naomi, you are also acquiring Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead man, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance.' At this, the next of kin said, 'I cannot redeem it for myself without damaging my own inheritance.' At this, the next of kin said, 'Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it.'" And so this chapter starts with Boaz going out to the gate of the city. And when you think about this, Boaz has this plan in mind. He's sitting at the gate and he's waiting for this man to show up. And kind of like we talked about how Ruth just so happened to stumble on the field, the text kind of presents it as this man, as soon as Boaz sits up, by coincidence, right? By coincidence, he just happens to be there at the same time as Boaz. And this guy is really interesting because the English text here doesn't really draw out, I guess, what's going on, or this translation doesn't draw out what's going on with this guy's name. So his name in Hebrew is Poloni Almoni. Say that fast, right? Poloni Almoni, Poloni Almoni. And basically, in Hebrew, that means so-and-so. So Mr. So-and-so has shown up by the gate, and Boaz is sitting there. And it was the practice of the people at that time. The elders would go and they'd sit at the city of the gate, and the elders would kind of act like judges, and they'd act as witnesses for legal proceedings. People would go to them with problems. You might think about it today how elders in our church, right? People go to elders and they help kind of facilitate difficult situations so that there can be peace and harmony. And so that's kind of what's going on here. And so he has this opportunity, Mr. So-and-so has this opportunity to redeem the land. And Boaz goes, and he does the right thing here. He says, you know what? I know I want to marry Ruth, but somebody else is ahead of me. Somebody else called dibs, so to speak. And so I am going to do what I know is right in the eyes of God and in the eyes of the law. Now, the problem here is as Boaz presents this beautiful opportunity, you're sitting there and you're going, okay, but I really, really want Boaz and Ruth to get together, right? We talked about that hashtag Booth, their beautiful relationship name. And so you want them to get together. And so Boaz he goes and he offers this opportunity to this other man. And all of a sudden, you're sitting there and you're going, okay, good, this is going to work out great. It's all going to go smoothly. But then the guy says, yes, I want to redeem it. I want the land. And you're sitting there and you're going, no. This is not how the story's supposed to go. I thought it was supposed to end up with Ruth and Boaz together. But how come this other man is about to step in and ruin what we think God has ordained? And I think that's true. Boaz, by doing what is right, creates an opportunity for things to go wrong. And I'm sure that there are times where you have felt like that, where you feel like doing what you know God has called you to do is only going to create more problems. And that's the situation here. He goes and he's like, all right, I know what God has called me to do in this scenario, but this could backfire horribly. And yet, we see that Boaz, he's no dummy. He is artful in the way that he sets this up. He gives him the good news, and then once the guy is bought in, he sours the deal a little bit. He gives him the fine print of this, and he says, wait a minute, if you do this, you also get Ruth the Moabite with this deal. And to give you an idea of why this is a big deal, okay, because you might think, oh wow, 2-for-1 special, this is great. It didn't actually work like that. Because what would happen is he'd buy the land, and then by buying the land, he would acquire Ruth and Naomi, and that would mean he'd need to front the money for the land and then support Ruth and Naomi financially. And then if he and Ruth ended up having any children, it'd mean that this child would actually be treated as Ruth's dead husband's child and not his. So what would happen is that child would then grow up, and the land that he bought would then be turned back over to Ruth and Naomi and their child. And so basically he'd be taking on all of these financial risks, all these financial debts, and really would get nothing for it in the long run. And so you see his heart come out here, where he realizes, man, if I do this, this could really hurt my own family. This could really ruin things for me. And I know you might be able to think about it, if we think about it in modern terms, you might have a family member that has tremendous debt. You want to help, but you know that their debt is so big that if you try to help, it could really destroy you. It could destroy your family in the process. And so when we look at this story, there's something that the text wants us to understand that you will not get unless you read the whole book of Ruth in one sitting. Now, I've tried to give us some different biblical principles as we've been reading, and this week's is our final biblical principle, is you have to look for elements that run throughout the story. And one of those elements that's here is there's a mirroring of characters and a mirroring of situations that happens between chapter 1 and chapter 4 and chapter 2 and chapter 3. And in chapter 1, we saw that Naomi had 2 daughters-in-law. Remember, we talked about Ruth, and the other one's name was Orpah. And so Orpah has this opportunity to stick it out with Naomi, to be there for her, but ultimately decides to walk away. And so now we hit chapter 4, and you have Mr. So-and-so who has the opportunity to stick it out, but ultimately decides to walk away. Now, is he wrong for walking away? Again, those situations, it's hard to know. But what we do see again is that Boaz is willing to do something. Maybe he's able, but he's willing to take on a challenge, a hardship for him financially. This is not like great for him and his name financially if he does this, but he's willing to do it, and that's why he's lifted up as the example, as the biblical example here, in a way that someone who just does what is required for them doesn't do. Right? Again, we see that love going beyond obligation. And so normally what would happen is if someone turned down this redeeming, is that the widow had the option to go to this man, to take his sandal off from his feet and run around town kind of shaming him and saying, it says in Deuteronomy 25, it says in Deuteronomy 25, verse 7, it says, "My husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me." And so she goes to them, she pulls the sandals off, and she can go around town. She pulls the sandals off, she can spit in his face as well to shame him, because he's saying, you have not taken care of your family. This was a big deal back then. And so he has this opportunity. This is what we see could happen to him if he turns this down. But thankfully, Boaz is there to step in. And I think this is important for us to remember. It's a little different than that situation I read in Deuteronomy for a couple of reasons. First, Mr. So-and-so is not Ruth's dead husband's brother. So he's just the next one in line. So maybe she didn't have to do this. Also, Boaz is the one who brings this situation up to him. But I think more importantly is there is a heart behind the law of God that I think that supersedes the letter of the law. What is intended here is that God's family, that God's people are cared for. And so Boaz stepping in and being willing to do this, I think alleviates the need for shame, because there's a direct opportunity. No one is being left without family. No one is being left without a home. And so Boaz goes and it says in 4, picking up in verse 7, that he actually removes his own, that a sandal is removed. It says, now this was the custom in the former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging, to confirm a transaction. The one took off a sandal and gave it to the other. This was the manner attesting in Israel. So when the next of kin said to Boaz, "Acquire it for yourself," he took off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have acquired from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Mahlon, to be my wife, to maintain the dead man's name to his inheritance, in order that the name of the dead may not be cut off from his kindred and from the gate of his native place. Today you are witnesses." Then all the people who were at the gate along with the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make this woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you produce children in Ephrathah and bestow a name in Bethlehem. And through the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." And so the community praises their union. Really what the book of Ruth does, it's a shift in how someone is understood. Ruth shifts from being an outsider who doesn't belong, who is constantly identified as a Moabite. She's identified by how her ethnicity is different from the people around her, to now she is welcomed into the picture. She is welcomed into the family of Israel with open arms. She is a worthy follower. And some scholars even think that this book is written as a counterweight against some of the laws in the Old Testament that say, you shouldn't marry non-Israelites. And that kind of, for those of us that believe that the Bible is the Word of God, sometimes when we see things like that, it can be hard to say, wait a minute, why is the Bible praising the marrying of an outsider where at other times it condemns it? How do I handle that? How do I deal with that? And so we have to say either that the Bible contradicts itself, as some say, or we can say, well, sometimes certain things are appropriate and other things are appropriate at other times. And we understand this with life, right? Sometimes it's appropriate to punish someone because they've done something wrong. Other times it's appropriate to give them, to let them off the hook for the consequences that they can do. We get that, right? The different things sometimes are appropriate for different situations. Or maybe this law is merely like an extension, or this situation is an extension or a clarification, saying you shouldn't marry an outsider unless they're really not an outsider, and you just think that they are. And I think that the challenge with some of these interpretations is that they require wisdom to understand what God is trying to convey more than we just want to look at the rules and say, okay, I'm going to follow the rules. And that's uncomfortable for a lot of us because we want to be able to control and say we know what God is saying in every situation. But I think one thing that the text wants us to understand is that Ruth is not really an outsider. She has embraced and embodied the heart of God better than even this man, this so-and-so who lived in the land of Israel. And that should cause you and I to pause, to think about, wait a minute, you mean that there are people who are outside of my group, outside of maybe my church, maybe even my denomination, that get and understand the heart of God better than I do, better than we do. And so Ruth comes in, and here she is, someone with a different background than the people of Israel, yet really, she is a true Israelite in heart. And I think that can be hard to do when we encounter people today. It's very easy to look at the surface level things. You might say, oh no, like somebody likes a different style of worship music than I do. they are not a true follower of the Lord. They don't get it. You know, some of these things might come up as we're talking about worship in the coming weeks. Wait a minute. So some people want to raise their hands and dance and sing around and praise the Lord in that way. It's like, isn't that disrespectful to God? Or, you know, some people may look on the other side and say, wait a minute, why are you standing there like this and just singing? Where is your passion? Where is your faith? And so we have to wonder, before we judge someone who is an outsider, do we look deeply at their heart? Do we look deeply at their life? Because here's how the book ends, right? The book ends with Boaz and Ruth. They get married, they come together, and they bear a son. And this son is a blessing on the family. You even see Naomi, who has been wanting to be called Mara throughout most of the book, this bitter woman. She has this like change. She's like, oh, the Lord has restored to me all that was wrong. And so you see there's this parallel between chapters 1 and chapters 4 where everything goes wrong in chapter 1, but then by chapter 4, things have come together. Right, the start of the book, Ruth and Naomi are wrestling with tragedy, and we want to believe that we should just have this kind of smooth, clean journey, but that's not what we get in the book. We get things could have gone wrong at so many different points in this story. It could have gone wrong when Ruth could have walked away with Orpah. She could have said, I'm out. Could have gone wrong there. Things could have gone wrong in chapter 2 if Ruth just happened to stumble on a field of somebody that wasn't Boaz, somebody who wouldn't actually be kind to her and care for her. And yet we see behind the scenes, she just happens to come on the place that God has called her to. Chapter 3, things could have gone horribly wrong with their plan. They could have gone to Boaz in the middle of the night. They could have been discovered. Somebody could have said that they were doing something scandalous, and it could have ruined Ruth's reputation. And then people wouldn't have said, oh, yeah, we bless this marriage. They would have said, wait a minute, this is a scandalous woman. We can't bless this union. And yet, even though things could have gone wrong over and over and over again, even in this chapter, right, things could have gone wrong if the other guy had just said yes and married it. God somehow worked it all out. I got to tell you, sometimes I really resonate with some of my friends who are, I can be pessimistic, but I know that there are people that are just like in this place where nothing is good, nothing can go right. And sometimes you look at, you think about all the things that could go wrong, and you almost feel like, man, how do things ever go right? How do things ever come together? And yet, this isn't where the story ends. You know, Naomi and Ruth leave Moab with no husband, no children, no prospects of how they'll survive, and yet they come back full, with a family, a new home, and a new future. And I think here's the challenge. It's easy to talk about this, it's easy to talk about tragedy when we're at the end of the story. Right? We're here. We know how things turn out for Ruth and Naomi. We know that things are they get their kind of happy, quote unquote, happy ending. But if you remember, and you know what this is like, to be at the beginning of the story where everything around you feels like it's falling apart, how do we handle that? How do we wrestle with that when life feels like nothing good can happen? Nothing good can change. You know, you think about when we lose someone. And unfortunately, when we're in that horrible place, sometimes the bigger picture you and I have of God, the harder it can be to wrestle with tragedy. Now, in one sense, right, we can say tragedy is a good thing in that we can, maybe if you have big faith in God, you can say, man, God, I know you're going to pull me through. But sometimes it can just as easily be, man, God, I thought you were a big God. How could you have let this happen? And so we have to wrestle with these types of questions. You know, even this ending, in some ways it's very satisfying. But I think you and I can understand that just because some new thing of joy comes into our life, it doesn't necessarily make the losses that we've had before any easier. And so we see Ruth and Naomi as they wrestle with all this stuff. It's not that and this is true, I think this is true for us. Sometimes it's not that we get over the things that happened to us in the past. It's that we allow God to produce new sources of joy for us. And so we recognize that there's something else to live for. We recognize that things that even though they look so dark, so terrible, the story does not have to end there. And this is beautiful. If you are a Christian, and I appreciate what Chuk said today in the welcome, our situation, we see this story with Ruth and Naomi and Boaz, how their circumstances do change. And that's true. But that's not always, at least the case in this life. We don't always get to see or experience, right? As much as we want to say things always work out in the end, really the only way we can say that is because we believe in a God who resurrects the dead. And that we know that even if we die in this life or if a tragedy happens, that's not the end of the story. This part of our story is just the beginning of an eternity where we will get to worship God together with Him as we really see how He rights all that has been wronged. And if we're waiting sometimes for God to fix things in this lifetime, yes, God works in our lifetime. We don't always have to wait, but we need to recognize that things will not always work out as we see with Boaz and Ruth. And that sometimes we are waiting for that hope of the next life. We are waiting for what God will do in the future. And sometimes when we're in that dark place, that's all we can do. All we can do is sit there and believe that things can be better, that tomorrow will be a better day than today. All we can do is look at stories like Ruth and Boaz and say, God, you worked in this situation. I can't wait to see how you're going to work through mine. And we see the example of one another. We see how God has worked in the lives of other people who have been in hopeless, horrible situations that we thought there's no way life can take a turn for the better. And yet, we see God work a miracle. That's why I think this story speaks to us in such a primal way. What started as a tragedy, literally the story kind of presents it within 2 months. Within 2 months, they're in a completely different place from where they started. And I think that if you're going through a hard time right now and you think there's no future, there's no prospect, that's what you think about. Man, for Boaz and Ruth, they really are, they're together. They're together, right? It's like when you're married, you're one, they're together. Boaz and Ruth, there's one. Their future changed in 2 months. Where could you be in 2 months? They say that those who are wrestling with whether or not they want to keep living, they say that as you're talking to them, if you can just get them to talk to you, to stay on the phone or to just be with you for 5 seconds, it's all it takes to get somebody to reconsider taking a final action that might end their life. And I think that's so true, right? Sometimes we think life is just so horrible that if we can just stop and say, wait, let me stop for 5 seconds, we might be able to see that there's a future beyond our circumstances, our current circumstances. And as much as God works through this scenario and this situation behind the scenes, that's not the only thing that makes this work out. What we see is that because of this incredible love, this steadfast love that these people, that Boaz has for Ruth and Naomi, that Naomi has for Ruth and vice versa, and all this love that they have for one another, we see that everyone's needs get met. And that's how it is today, right? Christians, we understand this concept that sometimes we can't figure it out on our own and we need someone to help us, somewhere to be there for us, someone to love us beyond what they're obligated to do to help turn these terrible situations into beautiful ones. And it causes us to think that their example, the example of the men and women in this story, cause us to have to think about, wait a minute, am I willing to take on hardship to love the people in my life? To love the family that God has given me, both your blood family and your church family. Am I willing to love that way? Am I able to love that way? Am I willing to love my community, who I may not even have these close, intimate relationships with? It's a story about ordinary people with extraordinary love. And this is another great example, right? We see this, and we see this example in Jesus. He is the ultimate administrator of justice for you and I before God. You know, he came down to earth. He died for us. He has given us everything we need so that we can have a relationship with our Father in heaven. And this is a perfect time of year to think about being grateful for that. Being grateful for the ways that God has delivered us and grateful for the ways that God can continue to deliver us. Because really where the story ends is that this union between Boaz and Ruth, got it, gives us, eventually, it gives us King David, who eventually, his lineage leads us to Jesus Christ. And so God has worked through their line, just these ordinary people who loved extraordinarily, to bless you and I and to bring a blessing to all generations. And so, as ordinary people, you and I, we're just ordinary people. John Legend, right? Just ordinary people. We don't know which way to go. What can we create as a family that loves beyond obligation? What tragedies can God use in our lives to bring blessings to generations to come? You know, it all starts with a deep love, and I appreciate that because that's something that any of us is capable of, so long as we let God create it in us. Amen.